stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. What a pleasure today. I get to speak with my friend Deb Helfrich, and we met on LinkedIn about 4 years ago, and just her comments on LinkedIn always caught my attention. They were always so full of insight. And the two of us actually co-wrote one of the first co-written articles on LinkedIn about 3 years ago about the power of comments in the comment section of LinkedIn. That's where the gold is, and connecting in an authentic way by sending a personalized connection request. So welcome to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will podcast, Deb. Thanks for joining me.
I am so ecstatic to be here. I mean, you're just doing such a great job with this podcast. I went through last night, and it's just a lot of really incredible stories that take life and work and sort of give fresh perspectives. I mean, this is what we're missing, is we're getting so many just standard ways of being when we're all just precious people. And it's just so fascinating how the journey to create right livelihood, to figure out a career that we can use our best selves, but we can also bring all of our randomness in. I mean, this is what it's all about. I mean, we're in America. We should all be having careers that light us up.
Exactly.
And
thank you.
It is such an honor to be here and to kind of talk about my really, 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 really crazy spiral path.
Yes. Well, and you summed it up really well, that that's what this podcast is all about, is those stories that throughout our lives start to define who we are, and that we can make adjustments that we want to make at any given time if we take the time to think through where our patterns are and the things that have happened to us that then we reacted to, and figuring out how to move forward instead of always looking back. So you did a great summation there, all these interesting stories of people. I'm not going to say random people. I'm going to say people with stories, which is every different kind of person.
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing, because what I really liked is, I mean, I met a lot of people. I thought I was just going to be, learning more about people I knew, but there were a lot of new people for me to sort of make notes about and want to learn about. And that's what it's all about, is, again, careers. I mean, you can be an accountant, but you can be an accountant on a movie set.
Right.
You take that passion and figure out how to make a living because you're good at numbers. But you can take that good at numbers and do anything. You could be an accountant for a ballet troupe. Or there's just so many ways. Or you can go into artificial intelligence. You can go back to my alma mater, where the Navy, I've just got a message, is all embedding people, because you need the technologists to understand what it is they're building.
Right, exactly. You need translators. You need people who speak both languages, the techie and the regular down-to-earth people like me. So thank you. Well, let's start with the same question I ask every guest on my podcast, which is, tell us something about you that most people wouldn't know. You wouldn't find it on your resume. And I like to start with that question so that our listeners get a chance to know a little bit of something about you that's outside of the realm of what we might dig into during the podcast.
Well, mine is both, I think, really shocking but also exactly what is going to transpire in my life. So, do you know that I've worked with Zach Galifianakis?
I don't know who that is.
Nice big movie star, very funny guy. I personally think of him from the TV series where he was with Jason Schwartzman and Ted Danson. But he was also on the whole Bachelor movie in Las Vegas thing with Bradley Cooper. Why I can't remember the name.
Oh, okay. I know who you're talking
about. The guy with the beard, the sort of gingerish, kind of loud, funny.
Yeah, he's hilarious.
Yeah, we worked together. This was about 10 years ago. I decided I wanted to be a method screenwriter. So there's all these courses on the internet, how to create a screenplay and all this kind of stuff. And I said, nah, I'm just going to go work on a movie. I went on Craigslist. There was a movie filming here in Seattle, way out east in Snoqualmie. They were looking for hairdressers and makeup people, and I said, hey, let me show up for free. So I have an actual credit on IMDb.
Oh, that's so cool. I did not know that.
I know. Nobody, it's so funny, is most of my stories are locked in. Is people just don't quite give me enough time, and I usually give most people the floor. And then their time goes up and they don't even know anything about me. So yeah, worked on a movie, have a credit on IMDb, and having woken up at 50 with all of this newfound energy, I'm now going to make a movie. It's going to prove that racism is an idiocy that just doesn't make any sense. Skin color is this thing that should unite us. It says nothing but where we're supposed to optimally be on the planet. Is all it really says. Is our relationship to the sun. What sort of degrees should we be? How much electricity can we make from the sun based on what our skin is? And what I've discovered is that the very, very light people like me, the freckled people, and the very, very dark equatorial skin people have real work to do. And what's happening in the world now, what we've done to the relationship of the earth and the sun, as it's changing, if we don't stop, if we don't figure out how to live on this planet in a lot more harmony, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have nothing but freckled people trying to live in caves and the people who can live in the equatorial regions. I mean, that is pretty much a scenario that we have to start planning for. So why are we looking at people like me and people who have very, very dark skin as though we're somehow different, not standard? All of the ways we're looking at these things can be changed in a movie that celebrates the two extremes of skin color together, figuring out how to move the earth forward.
That will be a fascinating movie, almost sci-fi, but based in reality. Maybe it'll be kind of like some of those things that we saw in Star Trek and Star Wars way back, like 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that are now actually happening.
Is I sort of am planning it in the just sort of like 5 months future realism. So, a sort of just about right to happen so that we can all just kind of see is that skin color, whatever we've built culturally around it, it's a really, really cool thing.
Right.
And it all sort of came from, again, sort of my midlife crisis and not knowing what to do with myself. And I was never curious about why was I this redhead and nobody looked like me and all these kinds of things. So here's another fact you don't know about me. There is a portrait in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam that looks so much like me that it is spooky action at 400 years ago.
Wow.
It is an astounding similarity, apart from the fact that he was identified as a male. Otherwise, he's holding these little gloves. It's all formal, dress. We look so identical. It is scary.
I love that kind of aha moment. Like, oh, I bet we're related somewhere down the line.
So I always kind of got the Germanic stuff, but also apparently I'm really Dutch. Being really Dutch makes a lot of sense to somebody like me.
Especially with your coloring.
Yeah, Seattle and Amsterdam are very equivalent as far as, the grayness, the liberalness, the sort of
community-minded.
real sort of radical intellectualism,
Mm-hmm.
which is how I found out about this portrait is just a book called Amsterdam by Russell Shorto, who basically said the reason the Dutch are so liberal, so open-minded, has to do with the fact that they created their own land.
Mm.
Apart from all of, when you think of more Southern Europe, the church was the landowners. That's how sort of society as we know it was created, was by the church and all of the land that they had. Well, in the Netherlands, they literally had to labor to fill in all of the marshes. They created the land. So if you did that hard labor, you became a landowner. You didn't have to follow what the church said. It's a very, very interesting theory, and how that sort of comes forward. And in this book, which again this is the sort of ways that I think very deeply about things, there is a contemporary of the Anne Frank. There is a woman who went to school, lived around the corner from Anne Frank, and who survived.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, the book came out in 2012. Last time I checked, which is probably about 3 or 4 years ago, she was still alive. This woman lived in the exact same life as Anne Frank and survived. Do you know why she survived? Because she was sick. True that. So this is, again, my 9 years. I lost my 40s due to chronic illnesses that almost nobody has any clue that I even had. Because I managed it myself. I had to know, I had to think about it. I had to figure out how to fix it before I could start talking about it. Most people go, help me, help me, help me. And I'm just like, no, I don't even know how to describe what's wrong with me. But so anyway, this contemporary of Anne Frank, the reason she wasn't exterminated by the Nazis, because she was so ill. She was in the infirmary on the very day that Anne Frank died. And it was the fact that she was so weak and that she felt that when they were hurting her towards her final end, she could not physically make it. That is what actually ended up keeping her around into the 2010s. And she lived this whole life.
Crazy.
Anne Frank didn't get to live. And we got to learn about her in this book that probably I'm one of the only people who's read in America.
I don't know. We should probably ask Jeff Eichler. If anyone has read that book, it would be Jeff Eichler.
Part of it is it's so funny that I think all these conversations are going to be starting from my comments. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but nobody seems to have the time anymore to sort of want to contextualize, okay, it's really bad that, we're all getting sicker and sicker and suffering from chronic diseases today. But how does that contextualize in history, and how does that play out in sort of the larger sense? Because everything we're getting wrong today is because we're not accurately telling good evolutionary stories. We're dealing to being popular, being standard, being pretty. And how I came up with all this new energy is I just sort of said, pale freckled skin is the newest evolutionary model in skin color. It's the most current. And why would that be? Why would evolution want all of us gingers around? Is there a reason? Well, of course. If the planet gets darker and dimmer, some of us might have to learn how to live in caves, or in places like Seattle and Amsterdam where there is not very much sun. And if that were to happen, people like me might actually start to thrive and be the ones who would actually come forward and save the planet.
You know what's interesting about that, Deb? I mean, beside the fact that that's interesting, is that I read recently that autism and Asperger's may also be evolutionary changes in terms of being able to focus on something and not be distracted because of our leaning toward the distraction of a goldfish. So what's fascinating about this, Deb, is that many people are suggesting now that autism and people on that spectrum it's an evolutionary trait, that people are learning to shut down that external stimulation in order to think more deeply. And I'll have to look up a couple of the articles that I read about that topic, because I find it so fascinating. And it really doesn't surprise me. And one of the things that I always wonder about, though, is, are these things being talked about because we have so much more access to know people? We're so much more connected now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And so it's not that there are more people with autism, it's that we are hearing more about it. It's not that there are more people with it, it's just that they're being diagnosed more because we know more about it. And that's my next question is, where does that go? But let's get back to your story.
Well, so you actually just went exactly to my story, because guess what? Without you having any idea, as I was just saying, I needed to know how to describe my problems. Do you know how I describe my problems? Adult onset autism. This is in writing. This is exactly what I believe is what I lost my 40s to. I got locked in. I could not be this person. I've always been this flamboyant. I really am actually a performer. And nobody ever encouraged me for it. Nobody, it was always, okay, nobody's paying attention to me. I'm just going to go read some more books. But I always had this. And what had happened with the brain fog and the just going, it's not worth trying to communicate because nobody's grokking me, and losing the energy and the capacity to speak, that really went all the way back to the childhood stuff. I probably should have been diagnosed earlier, but yet I'm not. It's a different thing, but yet it's the same, is that I always thought and processed very deeply. So there's the whole concept of highly sensitive people, of which I'm 100% at the edge, as I am as being an introvert. And I love talking about introverts because people go, you're so not shy. And they're just not the same thing.
Right.
I mean, there may occasionally be some overlap, but nobody is upset at themselves for being an introvert unless they're getting really bad environmental. But people don't like being shy. It's shyness is actually, you get trapped in there. And it's just like, look, people like me don't travel to Africa if they're shy. Case closed. You simply cannot be that person and have anyone tell you that you're shy if you can manage to just up and go to Africa for your own pleasure. Case closed. And then, of course, there is the whole software consulting thing. I mean, decades before there was any women in tech stuff, I was flying around the country going, let me have your payroll. I'll fix it. So these sorts of things, when I see what's happening on the internet, and I like it, I think it's...
I want to interrupt you just for a second. That I just want to go back to that whole introvert thing and just clarify a little bit. I really believe that it was only in the last maybe 8 to 10 years that being an introvert wasn't a bad thing. There, for many, many years, people ignored introverts and gave introverts and shy people a really hard time. I remember I was shy as a child. I know people are mostly shocked by that, but I was really shy as a child. And I didn't even speak in front of other people until I was like 4 or 5 years old. And my mom didn't even notice. It wasn't until an aunt of mine was sitting at the table with my mother. My brother had done something and I came running into the room upset and said, Eric did blah, 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 blah. And my aunt got so excited. This is a great aunt, my grandmother's sister. And she clutched her heart. She said, oh, thank goodness. And my mom was just so puzzled. And it all came out that she thought that I was mute because she'd never heard me speak. So I was very shy. And my mom gave me a hard time about it. You know, go ahead, go talk to your aunt, whatever, and go hug so-and-so. And it was always, I was given kind of a hard time about it. So I just wanted to clarify that point. And
it's a very good point. I think it's important that you bring that in so that I can say, look, I never thought anything was wrong with me. And nobody ever, I have to really, my community of origin was not able to really understand me.
Mhm.
But at the same time, they never pathologized me. I never got any backlash
So you
about
never got a stigma of being an
the
introvert
fact that
or
yes, and in fact, one of my big childhood stories, my dad worked in a steel mill. I don't think many people understand that I come from a family supported by a steel mill. I went
was
to
that
college in Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh? I was going to say that must have been Pittsburgh. That's
Yeah,
where my
yeah,
husband's
of
family is
course,
from.
yeah.
Mhm.
And Carnegie Mellon is definitely both and. It's a steel mill kind of, that's where all the money came from, the Carnegies and the Mellons. But yet, you can take that and transduce it into good in the world. You know, my parents were the Carnegie Libraries of my childhood. Is those books and the access that I had. I mean, I was a tiny, tiny, tiny child, and I got upgraded from the kids' library card to an adult one. And I'd be taking out 6, 12 books at a time. That free access to that library.
Mhm.
It is so crucial that kids have these things and that they're not just having Google figure out what kind of search results they want. We have to be really careful about how that's happening. I mean, I can't tell you the people I see who say, yeah, I'm showing up on my top page because it's you searching. If you want to see you, is you really have to take away any of that
The algorithm.
history that they have about you if you really want accurate search results.
So I want to hear about this. I want to dig into this a little bit about your time in the library.
Yes.
Was there an adult there that saw what you were doing?
No. I mean, this is our friend Wendy, who talks about genuine hero.
Uh-huh.
Part of my story that is very unique, that makes me an outlier, is I never had anybody be my advocate except for myself. Mm-hmm. And it was good. I don't know that many people could make it the way I did, but it also meant I really had no peer pressure to succumb to at all. In the least. So, again, we're talking about being an introvert. Well, look, as a woman of size, from the time I was an infant, that could have been pathologized like crazy, and it simply wasn't. And I learned how to make it to 50 without needing any Western medicine, despite what most people would have seen as something I needed to fix. Just as we talked about the skin color and my freckledness and how there's some real science here that I'm going to keep close to my chest here before it goes in the movie. But there's also science about fat people. Evolutionarily speaking, say something happens between the earth and the sun and it's really hard to get crops to grow and animals start going extinct. Who are the people who are going to be able to survive with their own onboard nutrition for the longest while we sort out that situation? The fat people. It's onboard nutrition. So yeah, we can pathologize it if we want to. And yeah, we can say, here's a really, really fit person, and you don't have the same statistics as they do. But does that mean there's something completely wrong with me? Or does it mean that I'm evolutionarily ready for certain circumstances that maybe didn't play out in the 70s and 80s, but actually may indeed be factually playing out in the 2020s? Is my success as an organism because I made it to 50 in this body, with this skin, with the internet, with this brain that is very creatively analytical? And so this is one of the things that I don't think people really get, is combining the two. Being creatively analytical means right now I can talk to all the scientists, all the researchers about medicine, human health. I mean, this is what I spent the last decade on. And I can do it as a philosopher who stored knowledge in very robust matrices of this relates to this and relates to that. So that, again, this is this brand new hypothesis, and I've not read what you read. I want the sources about, autism being evolutionarily based. But I literally, as I'm looking around, I am certain that part of what I should have been diagnosed with was adult onset autism. This got locked in, because I was like this in my 20s. Carnegie Mellon, traveling the world, software consultant, made enough money so that I didn't have to earn a living in my 40s. Like, that's pretty successful. And that's a success that we don't talk about a lot. That you can not spend your money on bling, but have it be there for you when something goes awry. That you can support yourself, that you can figure it out, that you can go out and find information from NASA scientists now that we have the internet. And you can find information from extreme sports guys. And you can go, how do I apply that? Yeah, I'm not doing what they're doing. But there's some interesting information about flow states, using ketones as fuel. When you start adding these things together and you look at yourself as this precious evolutionary model, evolution doesn't make mistakes. The question is does this particular evolutionary combination have a use in the environment in the lifespan of that person?
You know, what's also interesting about that, Deb, is that I've been reading, I read Larry Boyer's book, The Robot in the Next Cubicle. And it's really about how we can prepare ourselves for the future in terms of, I call it protecting our future income by building on our skills and making sure that we are relevant in terms of our skill sets. And when you think about it in the context of what you're saying, I think it brings it back to a more daily habit even. This isn't in the distant future. It's, what is it about me that makes me unique that I am where I am right now? Mm-hmm. Because not everyone is there. And being able to apply what you're saying to even, especially when it comes to things that are outliers, like people who are high functioning on the autism spectrum, and being able to apply that to learn which jobs are going to be around in the future that they are particularly qualified to have. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic over the next 10 to 20 years in terms of our workforce, because you're going to have both of these people, and you're kind of the middle between them, but you'll have the people with the soft skills. And by soft, I mean they're really difficult. Not only having them, but understanding how to use them in order to communicate and better our communities and take care of the most vulnerable of our population. And then you're also going to have those people who can creatively analyze and think through the data that they're collecting. So that's a really interesting concept if you want to think about that even more deeply.
Well, I do. I actually have two important things to say on that topic, because we're invisible. Those of us who are in these middles, right? I spent 20 years integrating HR and tech, speaking that language every single day, getting payroll systems and HR systems. There are no software systems as reliable as payroll systems. Part of when you hear me complaining about LinkedIn is, in my life, software does not work that way. Software cannot be that buggy. Is when you run payroll, you've never heard. It would be a national crisis if direct deposits didn't show up in bank accounts, because that software is so robust, so resilient, it's actually anti-fragile. And I know we're talking about resilience, and that's how my definition of resilience is being anti-fragile. It's the book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and it is about being human, being organic, flexible, dynamic. So when you brought up the things about the robots, I'm telling you what, maybe the 2020s, but we need to stop all that. I am 100% certain the technological singularity will never happen. Because if I get to have my say, the biological singularity, it's just, it takes away all that fear. Because what's going to actually become exponentialized is human brain capacity. It's this thing that, once again, there's nothing particularly special about me except the days of my lives. From man landing on the moon to now, I can prove just about anything with Wikipedia. I can get on stage and do a TED Talk and start talking about skin color and fat as nutrition. And there are ways that I could just have people get their smartphones out and go, well, look up melanin, look up ketones. I can actually have people verify these facts right as we're talking. Mm-hmm. And so we can keep creating really great machines, but the robots will never get better than us because we have to create the robots. So there's just never any way that they're going to get better than us because we're always creating them. Machines will never be able to do things that we as humans can't do better.
I hope you're right. So Deb, tell me about what you said that your childhood, you grew up basically in a Carnegie Library, right? Yes. So tell me what you remember of that moment or that time when you were given the library card that switched from a children's library card to an adult library card. Do you remember the actual time that happened?
Really, honestly, no. What I remember is daily or weekly visits where I had special capacity to carry home many more books than any of the other kids. And so it was this thing of most of the time I don't remember stories. I remember the output of what had to have happened in order to be able to be the special kid who could have whatever book she wants, who was able to just be there by herself as many hours as she wanted and look up anything she wanted. So do you remember what age that was? Not in the least bit. I really don't. It probably, again, was happening in first grade. A story that I do know, again, an interesting story that I find amusing now, but I was banished from reading in first grade out loud when the teacher needed to teach all the other kids how to read because I did what I just did. I just get going and just... It is impossible to teach other people to read when you let somebody who has already read the entire first grade book and who's testing into high school. And so a lot of, what happened to me as a child was really just leave her alone. We don't have anything to teach her. But where I think a lot of people would have struggled with that, it was just normal to me, and it created situations where even the challenges in my life were things where I had to just get curious. And instead of, having a forum and going and asking all of my peers about how to deal with something, I went into history. I went into the books. I went to find out how it might have happened in ways that weren't necessarily not even just acceptable, but possible in a small Ohio town in the 70s. I just sort of jumped into, there's this whole realm of human history, and I can get role models from anywhere. Right. I think a lot about people who study history and who really understand certain things about where we're going into the future because they've studied history. Like my husband, Bob, has a tendency to, he digs deeply into history books, particularly biographies, but he learns the stories of the history, and he's often prescient in terms of what's going to happen next in a country that he's already studied. And it's fascinating because it's so cyclical. Mm-hmm. But what I'd like to hear now is when you got onto LinkedIn about 4 years ago, and you started interacting with other people who could have those conversations with you, who were interested in having those conversations with you. Was that the first time that you found a community like that? No. So I have nothing but deep respect and love for the people I went to college with. I was probably a mute until I went to college. I had decided that speaking in small town Ohio was not in my best interest. In first grade, it was again this whole thing about, okay, I'm keeping other kids from learning, so I'll just be quiet. I'll teach myself. You kind of became invisible almost. Absolutely, but not if anyone would take the time to listen. And of course, my grades. And, there was no indication that I needed any special treatment or guidance. I just did it.
Right.
One story that people don't know about me is I actually made a policy so I could graduate high school in 3 years. I was so bored and so needed to go out in the world that I actually, the summer before my 9th grade year, I decided, I might as well just leave. So I actually made a policy. You could just smush all the requirements together in 3 years. It was the easiest thing in the world. And so, it's only spent 3 years in high school.
So you wrote a policy that was implemented at the school. That's awesome.
I wanted to get out to go to college.
So how did you do that? You just wrote it up and gave it to the school board and said, let's do this?
It's interesting, and I don't remember many of the details. I know I was the one who decided. I had been trying to go to boarding school, and that was not a discussion that could happen. So I said, well, I'm just going to go to college then. And I looked at the 4 years, and you could smush them all together. So I took like Algebra 2 and Trig together. I took English 3 and 4 together. No reason you can't. And so I just said, if I can meet all the basic requirements of the Ohio School Board in 3 years, and I took maybe 2 summer courses, because that was all that was offered.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, there was a time when they said they weren't going to allow that to be an exception because they thought a lot of women would get pregnant and try and leave school. And I said, well, this is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're smart enough and you can strategically, one of the things I found in your podcast is you're a strategic thinker. Mm-hmm. If you are a strategic thinker as a teenager and your environment is not giving you the opportunities to express yourself, you can go ahead and say, hey, do it. Yeah, I want out. And,
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of people who doubted me. But then I got accepted to Carnegie Mellon early decision in my junior year. So I said, keep your freaking policy. I can just take the GID at this point. You can either decide that you want to have the legacy of having graduated me or not. I don't care. I'm accepted to Carnegie Mellon.
Mm-hmm. That's funny.
It's an interesting thing to try to talk about stories because I don't think anyone's ever really asked me about my stories. I think I get going about too much other knowledge because there just hasn't been many people who've been interested in finding out how I got to be such an outlier.
So tell me briefly about your community in Carnegie Mellon that you were able to create.
Again, I showed up there and I said, oh, now I need to talk. And I picked Carnegie Mellon. I only got to apply to them because I got an early decision. The only other school I would have tried to apply to was Stanford. But again, in my small town, the guidance counselor said, well, we're not going to send your transcripts because you have to go to Carnegie Mellon. I said, well, I know I want to. But it would be nice to know if I could go to Stanford next year. Maybe if I've already gotten in, maybe I could, but they wouldn't do it.
Mm.
So at Carnegie Mellon, though, the thing that is so interesting is how broad the education is. Because, we're sort of known for tech, but there are so many Tony winners, the College of Fine Arts, Andy Warhol, Lucian Freud, the painters, all of the business school, the engineering, architecture. It was a place where basically anybody could do anything.
Sounds like a perfect fit for you.
It really was. We were just on LinkedIn. Somebody was celebrating Javier Grillo Maruz, who is created Lost, the TV series Lost. I remember him writing in our Tartan University paper. He was like one of the big writers on the college, and I'm like, that's the thing about being in Hollywood and having a name that nobody else has. It's having these unique characteristics. I'm like, I just know this guy from his little, articles in the college paper. And now he's this big person. And many of the people I went to college with have these really interesting, great careers.
So who did you connect with first? Like what happened first when you got there?
I remember there was a summer camp, and I remember I got picked from being from a small town because I knew it was Camus. But what happens is I tried to talk to people and nobody would get me, so I had to end up going Camus so that people's minds would switch in. Okay, she's talking about this French guy, Albert, the stranger. And so I forgot to click back on that now I was in a world where people knew things. And I remember it's just like, you're such a hick, you're such a hick. And I was just sitting there laughing because it's kind of true sometimes that in order to communicate, you are sometimes trying to think about how to phrase things, how to bring it about, but you also sometimes have to fudge the truth a little bit. So that if, crazy French pronunciations get you stared at, you go, okay, well, I'm just going to say it how it looks. And then you sort of forget to switch your audience after so many people look at you like you're crazy. And then you realize, oh, yeah, no.
Right.
It's textualizing for the right audiences, which is something I do have a problem with.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, when you don't have many conversations, when you grow up without having conversations, it can be a real challenge. In a way that, again, you start to go, adult onset autism.
Well, I think a lot of people are struggling with that right now, particularly because they do so much communicating online that they kind of forget how to talk to people face to face.
Yeah.
And I've seen that a lot as part of why I created the No Longer Virtual Conference, is to remind people how important it is to meet face to face and connect in that way, because our bodies are designed that way. Humanity is designed to be face to face, to touch, feel, smell, recognize those micro expressions on people's faces that you can't see on video.
Mm-hmm.
And so that totally makes sense, even in that context, that people are so used to communicating online that they forget that their audience is slightly different when they're face to face. And I have seen that.
It's a real challenge at this
Mm-hmm.
point in time about our attention spans and how aggressively we can say that's bollocks, that is woo-woo, that is fake news. I mean, we jump to these conclusions. And as somebody who's always been a deep processor and thinker, part of what happens is that I want to bring in such a broad base of things that I get off track and on tangents, because to me, everything makes sense if you can look at it through enough of a filter and perspective that you take away your own judgments, your own sort of needs, and you try and historicalize, you try and sort of pull things into a story that includes many perspectives is I think I really, again, get caught up in not just me, but in being that devil's advocate and saying, okay, this is what Deb experienced, and she got to this school and she met all these people who were doing all of these crazy things that she didn't even know you could come to school and major in saxophone.
Right.
I played the saxophone. I am pretty, if I could get it back up. But that somebody would come to Carnegie Mellon to major in the saxophone. And this is my friend Wayne Walters, who was actually from the Caribbean, and he also did steel drums. And now he's the assistant superintendent of the Pittsburgh Public School District.
Wow, that's awesome.
And I found that out on Twitter.
And he's a saxophone major. That's very cool.
It's this thing that we get very caught up in being one thing. And this is sort of some of the challenges of branding, personal branding on the internet. Part of why I know I'm an abject failure as sort of a business person is I can't niche. And the world needs me not to niche. It's this synthesis of all of these things that I can try and figure out how to talk about things in a way that most people wouldn't, that will come back around and open up somebody's eyes to seeing something that they were certain they believed. But here's just a little bit more data, right? Is
Yeah, just that
autism a
spark, right?
disease, or is it a feature of humans when they need to learn to blank out all the toxins, all of the dinging alerts and alarms? Do we need humans who can make all that go away in their brain and do quality assurance on air traffic control?
Right.
Only thing that they're obsessed with in their life. We need those humans.
Right.
And we cannot pathologize that capacity and drive it away unless that person wants a different life.
Or if they want to do it differently. Because there is always that need for the human interaction. Even autistic people, even on the far end of the spectrum, need people one way or another, even if it's not the same way that somebody without autism needs people. As a matter of fact, I read that book, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And I remember this moment of realizing as a mother of a boy, how differently that boy demonstrates his love for his mother from a boy who doesn't have autism. But I want to come back to this idea of you in terms of that persona online, your digital footprint versus an in-person. And it's interesting to me because your comments are always, well, not always, but your comments are mostly pretty focused, and they really generally relate to what the post was in the first place. And I remember especially 3 years ago when we were very active together commenting on posts. I remember so many of these just incredibly insightful comments. And then when we met face to face, I did see that difference. And you were able to have a quote normal conversation with me when we sat together outside and had a conversation with your dog running around. And so I do see that interesting, you weren't a different person. You were the same person, but that face-to-face conversation was different from what I had experienced with you online in a good way, because it was an extension of who I knew you to be.
It's an interesting thing that it has to be like that. I mean, it would be crazy if you were exactly the same. So your values, the sort of, who you are shouldn't be changing, but how you communicate. Because when you're writing a comment, and I know this is not how everyone else looks at it, but I'm under no time pressure. I would literally have like a dozen windows stacked up to be able to think about how to take all of this world of information I want to just spew out and how to put that into writing as a coherent thesis.
It's kind of like creating a quilt from scraps. And I know that I talk about this periodically, that I've been working a lot with the Gallup StrengthsFinders tool as an assessment and as a coach. And there's a strength called restorative. And the way that I like to describe it is that a restorative person is the person who sees something that's a 0 or a -1 and wants to make it an 8. That I call them quilters, that where I see scraps, they see scraps that could become a beautiful mosaic. Yeah. And these are people, the ultimate goal isn't necessarily to make it a 10. It's to make it make sense, to make it add value, to take something that was broken and create something beautiful from it.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing from you, is that restorative speaking very loudly. And a lot of restoratives actually like puzzles. So that also combines to make sense. And a restorative is somebody who sees a plant that looks to everyone else to be dead, but they know they can bring it back. They look at it and say, oh no, there's still life in this plant.
Well, there's this really really completely not talked about concept that I learned when I took a master's level linguistics course, that I found when I was reading through your past blog posts, that you at one point had said, so you're strategic, which I think we should talk about that, but combine the strategic with the slow processor, in quotes, that
Right.
you want to spend more time pondering or thinking about things. I think those two come together in what I call, it's a cognitive style of being either field dependent or field independent. And what that basically is how your brain works. If you're field independent, you're very linear. You can take in one piece at a time and output, one piece of data output, one piece of data output. But when you're field dependent, and I always have to make visual signs of a globe, you're taking a new piece of information and you're integrating it in everything you know. This is where, when I start trying to talk, I'm trying to contextualize well. And I can get off on really contextualizing far too deeply and far too extremely. But it's because, to me, why waste time communicating when you haven't established the context appropriately?
And that's where you get into danger. Because some people don't want or need the full context. They just want an answer.
They just want an answer.
Which is, again, it comes back to that importance of understanding your audience and leaning into that difference between online communication and face-to-face communication, because you have to read your audience and understand what they need from you.
It's also where stories are the answer. Right?
Yes.
As you just very clearly illustrated, is you can get going, but you come back to the stories. That's the whole point of the stories, is to contextualize, is to establish the rapport, is to go, we're talking about libraries, remember? We're talking about Carnegie Mellon, remember? These sorts of things are how, when you're just getting all into facts, it comes back to, here's what we want to talk about. And I think all of us, at some degree and some level, have to learn that balance of just giving away our pure expertise and a bunch of lists of things to do, a top 10 list, or trying to build a world where you're showing how that works, where you're demonstrating and you're giving people concrete examples. Well, here's this thing that happened. And it's really important, but it's not really how we're taught in school.
Right.
Is in school, we're taught to memorize facts and to regurgitate and to spell things correctly. And those things are really important at a basic level. But when it comes to communication, you're being creatively analytical. You're creating a mental image or a sense of emotionality in somebody. And that is really something that takes practice. It's you need to sometimes go to a coach and go, here's all this stuff. I'm creating this new business, and get the professional input. Well, you went off on this tangent, and maybe that's cool. And maybe you can write a real, official referenced white paper that some geeks will want to know, but come back to me. I love that you sort of can do this while you're having a podcast, is sort of use your expertise to help somebody else sort of get what's happening when they aren't sticking to stories. Because that's crucial. I mean, that is how we're going to gain business as independent.
Totally agree.
It is not fluff to figure out your story.
Right. Well, and I think so many people don't realize that those individual memories, those stories of specific incidents, are what will connect you to your audience. Yeah. And you can't do business without a connection, because we're not doing business with businesses. We're doing business with people. Right. And every connection matters. So let's, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, I would just love to hear one more piece from you. When you are putting together your comments that are so insightful on LinkedIn, and I would encourage people to go and look at Deb Helfrich's LinkedIn profile and then click on recent activity and then click on posts, you'll see her comments are very, very, very deep and insightful, and sometimes to the point where you realize that you have a whole other article that you're going to need to write because of that, which I think is brilliant. Tell me, when you started writing those comments on LinkedIn, is there one in particular, one incident or one time period in that time that really lit you up, that you realized that, because we wrote that article a few years ago about personalizing things and making sure you're creating a relationship with people rather than just creating a big Rolodex full of business cards.
Yeah.
Do you have a specific memory or anything about that?
One thing I like to start with is, because I'm not about achievements in the way that most people are, but when I think about the greatest thing I ever did on LinkedIn, it was that basically that fourth post got to Reid Hoffman. So I started in July of 2015, and by September 2015, 4 posts in, Reid Hoffman saw and liked my post. So how do you get to the founder of LinkedIn? You talk about all your crazy numbers of bots, but
right.
to have that kind of impact? And of course, as a co-philosopher, right? When I think about fixing LinkedIn, I'm always just trying to get to Reid. I don't want to mess with any other things. I want to have a conversation with Reid as a co-philosopher about what he's doing wrong, why the mission of enabling global economic opportunity never ever filters out to most of the users.
Right.
So that's my biggest achievement as far as I'm concerned, is that quickly you can have that kind of impact if you're really doing something that comes from who you are. I was out on a dog walk. I was out on a dog walk when I thought about writing about comments. I was walking my dog for lunch, and I said, geez, the comments, this is the communication. This is what this is all about.
This is the gold of LinkedIn.
It is where everything should be happening, because if nobody's talking, and this is what's happened now, this is why LinkedIn is dying, is because the videos, it just was it's nothing but praise. And then it became nothing but the weird chain letter of tagging and tagging and tagging.
Oh, it drives me crazy.
Have died. They've literally gone away. So as you say, go look at my profile, I say go look at my articles, because I am actually more proud of the way my comment sections, because I have basically written 12 more articles in responding to comments.
Right.
So whatever the article was, and I took my time and pulled it together, and I don't think I've ever written anything that I wouldn't stand beside. But going into those comment sections, where people were sharing, where people were going, wow, and talking about themselves, that's where I have my memories. I don't think I could ever, there's just so many individual stories, but it's that we created comment sections where real relationships were formed. Relationships that you could trust enough to invite somebody into your home.
Right.
That is so valuable. And LinkedIn has taken it away. I
don't know that LinkedIn has taken it away as much as
I think they have. That's my software opinion. So
yes,
that officially, that is my software consultant position, that they have taken away the capacity for conversations to have enough salience and meaning for people to invest their time in doing it on LinkedIn.
Well, what I would say is that LinkedIn has taken away the encouragement of creating real relationships because of their algorithm. Mm-hmm. But it comes down to us as users to make a difference in that. And I can say that despite the fact that I am so frustrated with the stupid algorithm in terms of video being promoted and articles not being promoted and me not being notified when some of my closest network members are publishing things, that I haven't published a blog post to LinkedIn in months and months. I post directly to my website, then share it on LinkedIn, and then find ways to get around the algorithm. That is very, very frustrating. I can also tell you, I continue to build rich and wonderful relationships on that platform. And For instance, I met Craig Thomason on that platform right before the No Longer Virtual conference in Atlanta this year in February. And he came to the conference and contributed such beautiful energy and intelligence to that conference that he's coming back to the conference in Chicago, and he's co-facilitating a session in NLV 2020. So we're still building relationships on that platform, but we have to be way more intentional about it than we used to be. But coming back to, so our listeners understand this, Deb and I had been commenting and talking on the phone for 2 years, 3 years, 2 years, when she said that she was going to come through Helena on her way as she was crossing the country. And I invited her to spend one night at our house en route with her dog. And we had a beautiful dinner together. And it was, I think you were one of the first people I met face to face that I had met on LinkedIn. And I remember that so vividly. I did meet John White when I was driving through Fort Collins at some point. And I had met Larry Boyer when I was back east visiting family, and Zach Messler during that same trip. And as much as the platform has changed and shifted in negative ways, I can say definitively that when we want to, we can continue to build those relationships. And
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, it's an interesting thing, and I think we both are very similar about this. It's gold, these virtual relationships, but then they are what they are. And until you get more senses involved, until you get beyond the keyboard, it is just not the same. And I've spent a year working on a project in Singapore from San Francisco. And yet, when those employees got rewarded to come to San Francisco upon successful completion of the project, it changed our relationship. So I would have said, I mean, we worked so efficiently across 15 hours and in different days. You know, it felt like we were so close, yet here they come, and just having that one meal, getting to take them out in San Francisco and showing them a good time, how that enriches our relationships. It's just exponential.
It is. That's exactly the word. It's exponential. And it's so funny because you think you're so close to somebody. Like I felt so close to Zach Messler over the years. We've known each other even longer than you and I have known each other. It's probably been 7 years or so we've been connected. I felt so close to him. But boy, the moment we hugged on the street in Northern Virginia, you're right. Exponential is the word. And now, I mean, I haven't met his family, but I feel like I know them. I love his wife. I've never met her. And I love that word, exponential. I was going to say magical, but I think exponential actually is a better descriptive word for it, because you have a much better sense of it, because different people have different ideas about what magical looks like.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
I'll leave everyone with a story that takes on the word exponential, and it's about, you know, robots and artificial intelligence, and, you know, the technological singularity is about them becoming smarter. And I just don't think it's something to worry about. I think we can very, very much use these capacities for good. But the biological singularity, which is a term I'm sort of making up right now, is when we learn to tap more into our unconscious. We've got this 40-bit processor that's basically in our prefrontal cortex. And we use that now almost exclusively. It's what we've been taught in our society, as far as the grammar and the spelling and things like that. But when we come back into the unconscious, which is what keeps our body working, which is the embodied cognition, the intelligence, we have got capacities that we really haven't yet dreamed of exploring. It's all on board. We just need to learn how to use it. And this is what a lot of the mindfulness is about. It is actually, mindfulness is about the backlog, the backwash, the upsettedness at how multitasking has fooled us. Because we can't multitask. We really can't, unless we go and get the unconscious involved. Because the unconscious is keeping us breathing and pumping our blood and making sure our immune system's working. We have the capacity there. And as we learn to use mindfulness to calm down, to get into these states where we can become creative, where we can enter flow, the capacity of humans is always going to be better than the machines that we create. That,
I totally agree.
Is the fundamental thing about understanding human intelligence, is that it's exponential. And you add one more sense when you get to view somebody, or you get to hug them, and it just, the richness of now how you know them, how you can trust them, what you can expect of them, it just goes, it's just exponential. Is you really can't dial it down in logic to say, oh, it's just this or that or the other thing. You become fully embodied.
Connected, right.
Connected, collaborative in a real dynamic way. So I think online, when you're collaborative just in text, it's just a back and a forth. But when you're together and you can see the person's energy and you can watch how their hands are moving and you can see their eyes light up, all of a sudden, there's something here that we can co-create, because I'm feeling as good as she's feeling.
Right.
Come in the text. It can, and it comes at a certain level. You get when people are excited, but you don't quite know how to respond back. It's this thing that we need to see, put movement to the excitement, to see the smiles in the eyes and all these things that you're getting buy-in. You're not getting a blank face. You're not getting puzzled. That makes creativity and dynamic change possible. So we have to keep going, making our lives no longer virtual. While
totally agree.
The virtual, let's never, ever, ever let it become the only way we are.
I totally agree with you. Thank you, Deb. This has been a great conversation, really fun. And I'm looking forward to more of our conversations into the future.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It was just so lovely to talk.
And for our listeners, in the blog post associated with this podcast, I'll have Deb Helfrich's LinkedIn profile link so that you can check out some of her old articles and more recent comments and conversations, because as we have talked about a few times during this conversation, the gold of that platform is in the comments. And as with everything else, you get out of what you put into it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away? Don't